Well, hello again. We're glad you're with us for another in our series of videos on the Broadcaster's Desktop Resource Lunch Gathering. This series is for your benefit. So tell us what kind of programs you would like to see, and we'll try to arrange it. You can also subscribe here on YouTube. Take a look down in the corner, and then there's a little bell, which will even help you further and let you know when we post a new video. At any rate, we sure do appreciate your support. I want to turn our attention to back to TAB, back to Jeff Welton, who is there on site live. And if you just came in, he showed us a portion of the floor, and it's a fairly busy floor, which is good because it's a good show. What we want to talk about today, Jeff, sort of a take it this way or that way. There's life above 5 volts. That's one way of looking at it. The other way is you got an IT person who is starting to be tasked with RF. What do you tell him?
Yeah, and that's an ongoing challenge, and it's something that we've been approaching with the SBE Education Committee. We're doing an RF for IT-oriented folks session. Actually, we just finished Module 2 about a week or so ago, and it's eight sessions altogether. We're doing another one. Wisconsin does one. Alabama's doing one, but we're seeing a lot more focus on training the folks who are IT oriented in working with the big volts, because it is really scary when you're used to working with routers and switches to walk into an FM plant and see blowers and big boxes and voltmeters on tube transmitters that have zeros on them, and lots of zeros on them. So it's definitely something that I think we need to work on a lot more. And this is where the folks in this room especially come especially critical. One of the things the SBE has started is instead of just doing a full mentorship, which takes a lot of time, a lot of people don't have, you can register as a subject matter expert, and you can make that window or qualification as big or as narrow as you want. Like I put down that, hey, I'm pretty good. I know a little bit about Nautel transmitters. So, if you got a question about an Nautel transmitter, feel free to give me a shout if you don't feel like going through the support routine. So that sort of thing. And, that's something that we need more people saying, hey, I know a little bit about tube rigs. So feel free to give me a shout. Or I know a little bit about continental tube rigs versus Energionics or whatever. So, that's, I think the big challenge is almost all of us, especially in our age group. When we started this, there was somebody that showed us the ropes, an Elmer, somebody to mentor us. And as we've gotten to fewer and fewer station engineers and a lot more contract engineers, that we don't have that ability. A station typically won't have 2 engineers on staff, so the old guy can show the new guy the tricks. And, the only way around that is to do stuff like this and educate as much as you can virtually. So, I'm all ears on any other suggestions on how we can get folks in front of transmitters and get them the experience. So, yeah, that's where we're at, in my opinion.
Well, I'm going to send you an email and hope that maybe later today, when things calm down, or tomorrow, whatever, we can have a conversation and pursue that thought a little bit.
Yeah, and I'd say I think it's definitely something. I mean, it was one of the things. For anybody who doesn't know, it's probably no secret at this point. I threw my hat into the running for an SBE board slot. Vote for me, vote for me. The cool thing about it is I don't care. And Jim Armstrong from TELUS just came by, and he'd promised me earlier he was going to try and get me to crack a smile in front of the microphone, and I promise you that's what the smile was for. But yeah, it's one of these things that we need to really enhance the education, because a lot of folks are leaving for IT because transmitters are scary things, and whether you're an RF guy who isn't used to all the computerization with a new transmitter, or whether you're an IT guy who isn't used to 10,000 volt plate voltage, it's just harder and harder to find somebody to kind of walk you through the steps.
Or
So,
even current. Dennis Christensen just noted it kind of
yep,
freaked me out the first time I saw my new solid state rig with 1,000 amps of collector current.
yep, yep, exactly. I mean, our 50 kilowatt AM transmitters, the ND series would run, you could run on modulation peak 1,500 amps of current at 70 volts, and that's a heck of a welder if you got a loose connection in there.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, it's like I said, I did a SBE mentor webinar yesterday, just talking about tips and tricks and stuff. And one of the things I mentioned was just kind of some of the things that you need to know for transmitter site maintenance overall. That as if you're used to running server farms, you're good with air conditioning, but you don't really think about the airflow direction because all the air goes in one end and goes out the other end. With transmitters, sometimes it goes in the front, sometimes it goes in the back, almost always goes out the top, unless it's liquid cooled and then it goes out to the heat exchanger outdoors. They all have different maintenance requirements. So, that's the sort of thing. I had a conversation earlier today about one of the things TAB is doing, and you were mentioning it, that Gil Garcia and Steve were doing with the cheap operator course. And we almost need to find a way to break that into somebody brought it up to me earlier about having just actual site oriented training. What do you need to look at, what do you need to pay attention to?
One of the things that Jerry Olson mentioned, he said our goal in passing things along is to make sure there's a long life above 5 volts. And I think that's a good way of looking at it. Ken Fine passed along the thought that they need to know what that little stick is, the grounding stick, and what it's for. Now, on a solid state transmitter, you're still going to have resistors and capacitors that need to be discharged, right?
To an extent, yes. I mean, on the newer FMs, most of the ones out there now, let's see, us, BE, Gates Air, Rhodey, we all use switching supplies that are self-contained. So you don't have those. But when you get into AM, you've got the tuning unit connected to an antenna that will receive anything nearby as well as it'll transmit. So that's one example. You've still got, in our case anyway, big rectifiers and capacitor filtered power supplies. So yeah, absolutely, there are things where you're going to need a grounding stick.
So all right, let's start out with the first thing. And I think that it's even non-technical, but it's important, and maybe even the RF guy should take the lead in putting together a book of all the critical data, if you are Star Trek, that you have, the model numbers, the serial numbers, the phone numbers that need to be called if there is a problem that you can't solve, number on the telephone and power pole, things like that should be available where anyone IT oriented can find it. Maybe they want file.
Over and above that, and this is one of the things that I beat the drum on, anytime you take over a facility, whether it's whether you've got a lot of experience or no experience, but if you walk into a transmitter site, you should, the very first day you're tasked with that place, go in and get a set of readings. Anything that you can measure, whether you're doing a data dump from a transmitter via SNMP, whether you're writing down the meters in a spreadsheet, do that, and then do a thermal image of all the breaker panels. And at that point, you've got your reference at least, so you can tell if something's changed. Because until you know what, and this assumes that you walk in and everything's normal and operating properly, which is Of course, almost never the case because these days we're all in reactive mode. A lot of folks don't go to the site until something's blown up.
Yep, yep. Of course, I remember one station that I was called into and took some meter readings with the field intensity meter and found out that their pattern was reversed. Where there was supposed to be a null, there was a bulge, and where there's supposed to be a bulge, there was a null. Looked at the logs, and it seemed like the previous engineer cranked the phaser every day.
Yeah, and funny, David made a good comment about things you should know. I don't know about having my phone number. I'll tell the funny thing is when I was doing tech support and field service on a day-to-day basis, and it still carries over with me now. If I lay hands on a transmitter, the last thing I do before I leave is tuck a business card into it. And it was always kind of my good luck charm. It was like the threat to the transmitter. It's like, if you don't behave, I'm coming back. And and it seemed to work. I didn't get a lot of repeat calls from those transmitters, so I think I did scare them into submission.
Well, that's
But
good.
well, what's funny, I was at the Arkansas Broadcasters Show in tail end of June, and I went out to do a couple of site visits with a guy there, and there was an AmFit 50 that started its life at CFDR 680, then 780, right outside of Halifax. And I cut my teeth on that transmitter. It's how I learned the AmFit 50, crawling through it at all hours of the day and night, usually rebuilding and repairing stuff because it had a nasty sight. But anyway, so I'm in Arkansas and I see this transmitter and I go hunting, and sure enough, one of my cards is tucked into it. And so, yeah, it was just one of those cool things. I saw one of my business cards from 30 years ago, but in a whole other country than where it started life.
No, that's interesting. I can I won't say that it was another country, but I did go into a transmitter building that I got asked to look into, and found my log notes from 30 years ago. And it was interesting to see what the parameters that we're currently running were compared to 30 years ago.
And I really like the comment Richard made about keeping the logbook. And whether it's a handwritten logbook or an electronic log, I don't care how you store it, but you need to keep records of all this stuff on a very regular basis, because I'm here to tell you, as you get older, it's amazing how fast things slip out of your mind. It's like I told my wife when she asked me to remember, go get this at the store. I say, sure. Do you want me to forget your birthday or our anniversary? Because the bucket's full. And so, for something new coming in, something old's going out. I wish you could pick what you were forgetting. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that.
There
So,
was
yeah, you absolutely need to have records.
this old cartoon that I remember in a elementary school class, and the one kid sticks his hand up and says, "My head's full. Can I go home now?"
And I mean, I've had those days, not just in elementary school. I've had them as recently as this month. And we're on day, what, 3 of the month?
There you go. There you
But
go.
but yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things. It gives you a reference of what you did, and it absolutely gives a history for the next person. I'm a big fan of storing that stuff electronically because it's a lot easier to search. I mean, you can take even handwritten notes. So with OCR, the way it is, that technology, Evernote, has expanded to the point that I scan my handwritten notes as PDFs, and then I'll load those into Evernote, and I can do OCR on my hand scratch, and it's pretty reliable. Now if you've got doctor or lawyer level writing, then that may not be an option, but absolutely, if you've got something like that searchable, then somebody can go in and look plate blocker or final voltage or something, and potentially have a reference point that'll save them some time and trouble.
I
And
remember when Warren Scholes at WLS, I think he had multiple binders of printed out copies of just that.
I've walked into sites. I've got one guy I've worked at on one facility who he had a studio book, he had a transmitter book, and then he had transmitter site book for anything that wasn't the transmitter. And yeah, I mean, he had a general notepad that he just wrote stuff on, and then he transposed it into whichever book was appropriate as he went through the day. These days, I don't know that anybody's got that level of time to do it. But whether you do it that way or whether you use voice notes and then do voice to text to transcribe it, there are options. Find one that works.
Yeah, that makes a very good point. And as long as you make it available, I mean, you don't want to have this file hidden so that the new guy can't find it, or somebody else, they're hiding it from the FCC, let's say, and you don't want to do it so good you hide it from yourself.
Right. And you need that. And then, like I say, the little tips that we all pick up. I mean, that mentor thing that I was talking about that I did yesterday was just 30 odd things that I've sort of encountered over the years. And I mean, like, one of the things that I tell folks, if you're working on one of our transmitters, the current ones, remember that when it comes to audio level, up is down, because what you're setting is the reference level, not the actual audio level. So you're telling it that 10 dB gives me 100% mod, and if I want to make it louder, I'll tell it that 9 dB gives me 100% mod. So turn it down to turn it up is how I remember it. But just those little tips for different products.
That is true, and I've seen people that got tripped up by that, including yours truly.
I'm going to say there may be one of them on this call. We've had that conversation.
Yes, and I'll admit to it. It took a moment to realize that it was backward according to your expectations, but it made sense in the end. Now, if we start out, and usually the way an IT person gets introduced to RF is the chief operator, chief engineer is out of town and something happens. And so they're asked to go to the transmitter site. So we have a question here. Where are the keys? How do you get into the transmitter site to do anything?
Well, in the most Texas of conversations that I've ever had, I had a guy call me from this neck of the woods, probably be 20, 25 years ago now. And we always used to get the call, hey, I'm going out to the transmitter site. I'll be there in half an hour. Can you be sure you're free so that I can get through to you? Dennis brings a good point up. Do you know where the transmitter is? I've actually looked up transmitter site addresses for new engineers who said, yeah, we got hired to look after this and nobody knows where the transmitter is. So you teach them how to go to FCC info and look up their site coordinates, convert that into decimal and put it into Google Maps. But so I had this guy and he says, can you be off the phone in half an hour so I can get in and call you back? And I said, sure. So half an hour goes by, no phone call. Hour goes by, no phone call. 2 hours go by, no phone call. Well, at about 2.5, 3 hours, I'm getting ready to shut down and head home, and the phone rings. I pick it up, and it's this guy, and he starts with, yeah, I'm sorry I didn't call you earlier. He goes, it's been so long since anybody was to the site, nobody could find the keys, and I had to shoot the lock off the door, which wouldn't have been a problem except for the sheriff's deputy driving by at the time I did it. So he goes, I've spent the last 2 hours in the police station while they tried to verify that I was, in fact, the guy qualified to shoot the lock off the door.
Oh, boy.
So I say it had to be the most Texas of conversations that I've ever had, although it would apply to a lot of places. It was just fun that it happened down here. Let's see. Richard mentions recording Excel meter readings on an Excel spreadsheet. And great way to track not just old backup transmitters. So the cool thing about newer transmitters, and I mean, I can only reference to ours, of course, but I've got the ability to go into the AUI, the user interface, and I can capture meters, and that will record every single one of the meter readings in that transmitter to the clipboard in my laptop. And from there, I can dump it into Excel, into Windows. And it's just great because if you dump it into Excel, you put it on one tab, then open a new tab, copy it to that tab, and then every time you do it, you copy into the original tab, and you just get a running list that you can graph. Let's see. Local vendor. Yeah, parts vendors are getting few and far between. I know there's an electronics store in Milwaukee, but holy smokes, it's not like it used to be when there was one in every small town.
No, no, Radio Shack is long gone, and many of the small parts shops.
Oh, Brian makes a good point too. I couldn't tell you how many calls we get required to tell people how to backdoor their way into the transmitter and reset the user accounts so that they can get into it because the password, somebody changed it and nobody knows what it is.
Yeah, that is a real problem
Right.
because
And I mean, this is something that the IT, the under 5 volts guys sort of understand natively, but we need to start treating passwords like facility keys. If somebody gets replaced, that password needs to be changed.
well, yes and no. Yeah, I certainly would agree with you that security is important. On the other hand, if you're out there in the middle of nowhere and nobody goes in the building but the current maintenance worker, I'm not sure that that counts. But at the same time, you can end up forgetting what that password is. And that's why it needs to be written down somewhere, somewhere.
Right. Well, and the other challenge is that these days, I would guess about half the gear we got's connected to the internet one way or another. Most of it through pretty well protected VPNs and LANs, and absolutely fine. Maybe half a dozen systems less so, but the number's pretty small. Point being that if you replace the guy doing the maintenance and he's the guy that knows how to get into that network, he doesn't have to be at the site to mess stuff up. So you do need to be aware that is an issue or a potential issue.
So we have to have a place where keys are. I don't know whether it should be in the studio, whether it should be in the engineering department, racks. It used to be that it was required that you be able to get to that transmitter at any time, day or night. Probably still is. Harold, do you want to talk to that point?
I don't recall anything on that currently. Maybe though.
Yeah, a lot of it depends on what you can do. If you can turn that transmitter off remotely, that's one thing. But if you can't, if your internet's down, you better have a way to get there. And you got to have a key or keys. If there's a gate key and then a transmitter building key and then a cubicle key, these are important things to know where they are. And this should be, again, documented and made clear.
Or if you got combination locks, what's the combination? You know. So yeah, absolutely. Another point to that is that keys are like rabbits. You start out with one, and then next thing you know, unless you're using a secure lock set, it's pretty easy to run down to Ace Hardware and get another set of keys made, and then another one, and then another one. And after a while, you pretty rapidly lose control of that too. So again, a word of caution.
We're going to go off course here a little bit, but I'll raise this question. I always arranged to have one key that took care of the transmitter building, all the tower base units and the gates, so that you didn't have to go through that. Some folks do that with a Medico key. And if there's anybody with us today that would like to talk to that, invite you to chat up. But the point is that if you have a whole pile of keys, you're in as big a trouble as if you had no key.
Yeah, and I mean, like at home, I'm trying to remember what I use. I think it's Quickset. Yeah, Quickset smart locks. So the lock itself is programmable, and I can program any or all of the locks in the house so they're all off one key. The cool thing is that if I need somebody to come in to do maintenance, then I can program one lock to a different key, give them that key, and whether I get the key back from them or not, I can use the mate to it to put the lock back to the original setting when they're done their work. So yeah, that's one example. Instead of carrying the big ring of 1,000 keys like Richard's showing, you can do it with one or two. Now, Greg makes a good point, though. A really big key ring can be a weapon.
So now you're out of town. The IT guy is called because nobody else in the building has a clue about anything electronic. I remember one time I was in Charlotte when the PA shut down on a particular Continental, and the IT gal, she very kindly went up to the site and was immediately worried about getting killed. And I told her, just listen very carefully, just do each step as I tell you. And I had her lift the breaker, get the transmitter back on the air. It was painless. She was a soldier.
Yep. And a lot of it's how you approach it. Calm and collected helps. One of the other things, and I did on our TTT on Tuesday, our focus for that session coincidentally was EAS. And coincidentally, because of course today the new public test, because the whole the emergency national warning or whatever they call it, warning system, or that the whole act. Yeah, thank you, National Public Warning System. I had a sheet of acronyms, but the only reason that's come to mind, I had Jim Gray from Optimized Media Group on, and he's also with AMPERS, the Association of Minnesota Public and Educational Radio Stations. And one of the things he mentioned that they focus on is having if this, then that guides throughout the facility. And for various functions, whether it's EAS protocols, whether it's what to do if the automation system crashes, whether it's how to reset the transmitter or how to get to the transmitter site. And so it's if this scenario arises, this is what you do. And so it's just a little guidebook established to help somebody who's not necessarily intimately familiar with procedures and protocols to navigate those waters without hurting themselves.
Yep, very good point. So we get them to the site, and we hope that they have a four-wheel drive if it's a bad site to get to. And they're at the door, they unlock the door, and they walk into the transmitter room. And what's the first thing they should do?
Look and smell.
That's right. Not answer the phone.
Yeah. Yeah. Now look and smell. Look for smoke. Smell for smoke. Look for sparks and flames, red lights, whatever. But yeah, you open the door, you poke your nose in, and it's like the first thing you teach you with first aid and emergency response. You do a situational analysis before you touch anything.
Back when remote control was first being considered in the 1950s, one of the arguments against it was that you had to be able to smell what was going on at the site.
That hasn't changed either. And Sal's comment about looking for snakes first is not a bad one, or Rich's, because you want to make sure the facilities are clear, because sometimes you walk in and first you say it, then you do it.
Yeah, it's important not to throw switches very quickly and punch buttons very quickly. There's of course the sort of idea that you walk in, push the on button of the transmitter, and that could be the worst thing to do.
Yeah, and I've had and so Harold makes a good point. Will people read the book? Because everybody wants a video. One of the things you'll find if you ever buy one of our new VX transmitters, the USB stick that comes with it has one file in it called Index. And if you click on that, it opens up a browser window. And on that browser window, you get access to the documentation. But there's also videos on how to unbox it, how to replace stuff, maintenance videos. Because, yeah, we're seeing the same thing, Harold. People don't want to read. They want to watch a 5-minute video on how to do this task. They don't want
So
to read
there's
a whole
the
100-page book.
Nautel TikTok unboxing video.
Well, no, YouTube, but yeah, damn near.
So we walk in, or the IT guy walks in, IT gal, and they don't smell anything. Transmitter's off. Now what?
And if you pick up the phone and call support, the first thing they'll tell you is look for red lights. And doesn't matter whose it is, if there's a red light, red is usually bad.
That's
true.
true.
So I tell people green is good, red is bad, orange could be anything. But those are my general rules of thumb. Now, having said that, there are some situations red may not be bad, depending. But yeah, look for any visual indication, and then typically you are going to call support if you're not familiar, and that depends on the gear and what time it is. Example, if it's a Continental transmitter and you're outside of business hours, you're not going to call support. So that's where that phone number list we talked to before becomes really important.
That's true. They could call you.
They could, but if it's Continental, I'm just going to give them Steve Haskamp's phone number anyway.
I thought you were going to say something like that. Yeah, there are a few people out there that understand Continentals. Some of them are with us today that have spent more than a few hours with their Continental transmitters. And that's really important to help the IT person network, isn't it?
Arguably is one of the things, and I mean, I beat this in every session that I talk about, was the networking stuff like this, or SBE meetings, or state shows. I mean, over and above whatever sessions they actually provide, the networking and learning who you know that knows what is probably more important than anything. And we've had this conversation several times over the past couple of days. It's I don't know all the answers. I don't even pretend. John Bissett and I had this conversation last night, and we both agreed neither one of us know even half of the answers. But between the two of us, we know pretty much everybody that does know the answers for anything. And that's what you need to know. You need to build that virtual Rolodex, or a real Rolodex if you prefer.
That's why I've kept the broadcast list going all these years. We have people that will respond to questions literally day and night. There are people that are insomniacs or whatever and have worked on virtually everything. In fact, we have a little thread going right now, my first transmitter. And it's interesting to see what transmitters different ones cut their teeth on, and got to understand the transmission facility.
Yeah, and I mean, John's made a good point with the Carl Smith seminar about don't panic being number one thing on the list. And that is absolutely true, because, and sometimes you actually got to physically think about not panicking, because, of course, it's off the air. The first thing that happens is your adrenaline goes through the roof. And, your automatic response is do something. And almost guaranteed, if you do something before you slow down and stop, that something's going to be the exact wrong thing.
That's where the GM comes in. He's ringing the phone, and you have to make that decision of investigating or answering the phone.
Yeah. And I mean, it comes back to, it's the weirdest thing ever, but the human body, by and large, in a panic situation, will invariably choose the worst possible option. I mean, if you get stuck in the water, splashing and thrashing is what we tend to do, when relaxing and floating is what we need to do. And it's the same with just about everything. I said, if I'm given two choices, the one I pick automatically will be the wrong one every time. And then when that goes boom, they'll be like, oh, well, then I can do the right one. I've already blown it up. It's not going to get much worse.
A lot of television series are based on that, There's tension because the bureaucrat will invariably do the wrong thing to protect his job rather than solve the problem.
Yeah. And Richard made a comment about one of the questions for potential techs being, tell me about a time you panicked. And Richard, I'm sure there's a story, so I wanted to get you.
Oh, you want to? Okay. Well, I went through quite a long time learning my own panic mode. And basically, you get a learning experience every time you're driving to a transmitter site with a dead carrier at the middle of the night that you haven't been to for a long time or have never been to ever. And over time, I don't know whether it was age or hormones or what, the pit of the stomach panic feeling gradually went away. And I realized, pretty much 100 years from now, who's going to know or who's going to care? And I'll go there and do the best I can. So that's pretty much my panic story.
There's another aspect to that too, and program directors notwithstanding, I think Rich Wood is standing by ready to contradict me. But after you've been off the air for 30 seconds or more, they're not going to be sitting there waiting for you to come back. They may check back from time to time, but there's no need to worry about getting back on that instant. It's more important to find out what's going on.
Yeah.
Barry, I'd like to add to this story a little bit, and I kind of second what Richard Rudman just said. I had an experience at KFI one time when I was by myself. I'd been driven down the transmitter after we were off the air, had some problem. And of course, the program director calls and asks me, how long is it going to take? And I said, well, that kind of depends, because it all depends on how long I stay on the phone here with you, because I'm not working anything when I'm on the phone with you.
Yep. Yeah. I went through that too. I really annoyed a particular owner because he wanted to know.
I told one guy once, I said, every time I pick up the phone, it's half an hour longer. And he goes, why half an hour? And I said, well, number one, I had to back out of what I was doing. Then I have to talk to you for a minute or two. Then I have to hang up the phone and get my head back into what I was doing before I can even step back to the transmitter. So I said, it's 20 minutes just for me to pick up the phone. And then whatever time we're on the phone plus that. So half an hour is your average. If you call me again, it'll be another half hour. If you call me again after that, I'll be pissed, and then it'll be an hour.
I like that. I've had that same experience.
Yeah. I think, what was it, Marvin? Tony Dinkle drove down to KFI there when it was off the air. And the first thing he noticed before he even got to the building, the tower was missing.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That was after I retired, a few years after I retired. But he called me that Sunday morning and said, Marvin, you won't believe this. I'm driving down to KFI, and that's the exact word. He said, the tower was not there.
Well, the first thing you do when you're off the air is make an announcement that you're off the air.
Thank you, Les.
Yeah, that's what you got to do.
There's the program director.
Get Les Nessman in to give a bulletin.
By the way,
although with streaming now, that does make sense.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, and
by the way,
I mean, be honest.
Barry, I was just going to mention briefly, Tony Dinkle passed away recently.
Yes, he did. Lost another good guy.
Another one. Tony was one of those guys that would call me every couple of months, not because he wanted anything, just to shoot the breeze a little bit and make sure, And David Stewart was another one. I brought this up last time we talked. But, I mean, I got an email from him after a hurricane hit Nova Scotia, just making sure I was okay. And I mean, we talk maybe once a year at the TAB, so it's not like we saw each other on a daily basis, but he saw something going wrong and immediately reached out to everybody he knew in that area.
So I hope you got a bunch of emails that week.
There may have been more than one or two, yeah. But anyway, that comes back to, and Mary mentioned the same thing in sales. You don't need to know the answers, you need to know where to find them. And in engineering, it's even more critical because, of course, if you reach into something when you don't know what you're doing, that's risky both for you and the equipment.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's always best to have and I'll say quote unquote, but the expert on the phone, whether it's somebody from the factory or somebody who knows that box really, really well.
Yes, really, you need that. And one of my very first, if we're going to go back to our beginnings and our first panic or whatever, I had a Gates FM5H, 7.5H that was off the air. And I pulled out the manual and I'm going through the manual and I'm calling Gates and I've got a guy on the phone and we discovered his manual didn't match my manual, which didn't match the transmitter. And that's the time when I started to panic just a little bit.
And that happens a lot. I mean, we change modules and designs. Transmitters are an evolution. And I don't download every iteration of every circuit board for every transmitter. So I'll have a manual for each transmitter model. Now, if there was a major design change, I might have two manuals for that model. But I can almost guarantee you that component for component, it won't match what's in the field. And the manual you match, depending on whether the original engineer put the change pages in that are issued after the fact, may not match exactly. So a lot of times you do have to use a little creative license and say, well, I know what this circuit's supposed to do. So, here's what we need to accomplish. And let's figure out what we've actually got.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, on the other hand, if you got a certain grounded grid 2-based product, the only thing you can guarantee is that the schematic won't match the manual. I'll leave it up to y'all to figure out which one I'm talking about.
Bernie is no longer with us.
Good guess.
That is if you got a manual. There are people that have written to me over the years about having a 10 kilowatt transmitter and no manual. And after doing some checking, turns out the station never paid for the manual. So Bernie figured he was going to send them one.
Yeah. And I mean, more and more, going back to the comment Harold made earlier about the videos, the other thing you'll see is like with us with our low power gear, the only manual, unless you physically pay for a paper manual, is the one on USB. Now, having said that, if it was me, I'd get the one on USB, run down to Kinko's with it, drop $180 and get them to print the manual for me, as opposed to dropping $250 with me to do the same thing and then ship it. But again, that's personal preference. The point being, I like something I can scrawl notes on, and it's hard to do that on a PDF. Not impossible, just harder.
In the old days, it was common to see a huge schematic up on the wall.
Yeah, I miss those, the big old 4x8 schematics that you used to be able to get, and people used to ask us about that because we'd break things down into blocks and then provide a 11 by 17 inch schematic of that block. And then you'd have an overall block diagram of the transmitter, but there was no end-to-end schematic. And that was one of the cool things. But holy smokes, it could take a little while to track through one of those too.
True enough. Would you ever consider doing them again?
I doubt it. I really do. Several reasons. Number one, almost everything we do, if you get down to component level, you're dealing with surface mount. And the number of people that are able to do surface mount work at a transmitter site, I could probably count on two hands. There are several who are capable, but most just don't have the gear at the site. So they're pulling a board and taking it back to the shop anyway, in which case all they needed was the transmitter block diagram to find the board. Beyond that, the transmitters tend to identify the component failures right down to the module anyway, which wasn't the case 30, 40 years ago.
True.
So the technology has changed. I really doubt that you'd ever see us go back to that. And if for no other reason than the cost of doing it would be into the several $100s just for one piece of paper.
I guess one of the questions that you have at that point is whether to have spare parts on site or just except that the new transmitters need to be more redundant. That's
That-
another diversion.
Well, and that's situational. I know Harold was going to say something too, so I want to hear what he had to say first.
Thank you. The old schematics, that was before the invention of net names. So you had a 4 by 8 foot drawing, and you had to follow one line of a group of parallel lines across the page. Really, really difficult. And now blueprint shops will take the PDF and make a nice large print for you. Here's one I did at Shirley's Plan Service here in Tucson. Very good. And it just reminded me of something else, but then I forgot. So back to you, Jeff.
And the thing I was going to with the requirement for spare parts, that's very situational. I mean, I know like groups like Crawford Broadcasting, for example, do a lot of surface mount work and do maintain both spare parts and modules because they've got a fairly commonized fleet. I mean, they run similar automation throughout all their facilities, similar boards, similar audio processing. So they're able to stock a lot of parts. If I look at my own station, we stock next to nothing, but coincidentally the factory's 45-minute drive away. So again, situational.
Here's my surface mount hot air gun. And on spare parts, if something fails, buy two. And then you're starting to build a spare parts collection.
Right, and a lot of it too comes back to, again, cost of return on investment. I mean, if I have to pay a contract guy $120 an hour for 8 hours to rebuild a circuit board, but I can buy that board for $700. It's again, you look at the economy of it.
I had a comment on fund general manager discussions at Georgia Public Broadcasting. I was once trying to explain the concept of availability with redundant circuits and transmitters and any piece of equipment to the 3, 4, or 5 nines. And by the way, I really enjoy the 2 nines advertisements for Dish Network. But anyway, the general manager says, "Are you predicting an outage?" And I had to tell him, no, that wasn't what I was doing. I was just talking physics. But he shook his head. And the other one was we had reduced power on an FM near Augusta, and the weather over there was freezing rain, and we had no de-icers or radomes on the FM over there. And he said, "Just how the hell do you know that? It's an ice problem at 400 feet up a tower." So we had to have a little discussion with him about how transmitters are telemetered. But you got to watch out because even though, and he was career in another part of state government. He got farmed off to us. So so a typical program director or station owner would know some of this stuff. But those two from the same guy always amuse me.
Right, and that's one of the ongoing challenges is, how do you educate somebody that knows nothing about the logistics of what we do as engineers even, and station owners. I've run into station owners where it'll be like, you're off the air, and he goes, "Are we? I can still hear it." And it's like, yeah, you're not listening to the air feed. And, so there are, educating the non-technical is a whole different discussion, but it absolutely is something that is part of the job. And when you're talking to a manager, and it's like I tell people, when you're doing an ROI discussion, when you're telling them why you need a new transmitter, you need to be able to break it down into dollars and cents and time off air. And I mean Mike makes a good point. There'll always be an outage. It's just a question of when. And the example I use is like power failures. If you spend half an hour off air a year cumulatively, and you only bill $5,000 an hour, and I'm making numbers up obviously, then you're probably not going to spend $20,000 on a generator to back up that site. Now if you're in an area where I am, where you spend 2 weeks off air a year because of power failures, then investing $5 or $6 grand in a generator makes a whole lot more sense. So yeah, you need to know both what the station bills and how long it's on average off air.
Of course, that leads us to a question of auxiliary transmitter and generator.
Well, in New York, 5 minutes off the air warrants a transmitter or a generator.
Oh yeah, yeah, and again, situationally. I mean, you look at, and it's one of the things I tell everybody. Every station you engineer, whether it's staff or contract, it doesn't matter. If you don't know what that station bills or underwrites to the minute, you got no idea the value of the off-air time, so you can't make an educated ROI statement.
And
Rich,
you're
how
trying to talk Congress into making sure that every car has an AM radio. You should try and stay on the air so that you can address the emergencies that they're hanging this whole thing on.
that's a
Just a
very
thought.
good point, and that goes back to our discussions about this AM radio in every car business, which misses the point of what's going on. It's the politicians are looking to pass a bill that the Europeans aren't going to pay attention to and doesn't solve the RFI problem. But
Right.
I wanted to circle back, Rich, to just a moment. What was the longest you were off the air on WR?
Oh, geez. I can't really remember a time because we had a generator at the studio, one at transmitter, spare transmitter. So it would be 2 or 3 minutes probably. Now we've lost audio. We once had some people come in and decide that there was a lot of copper in a big phone line cable. They cut it from floor to ceiling, which meant all the phones went out. Fortunately, we had an STL microwave. So, but you had talk show hosts just sitting there talking with no phone calls for hours.
That would make a talk show host nervous,
It would, yes.
even panicky.
Yes.
Now, did you call in from the other office using different voices?
No, I think who was that in Los Angeles that did that?
Bill Hendry.
Bill
Yeah.
Hendry.
We needed Phil then.
Interesting.
But it's
Jeff,
Sorry, what was that, Barry?
Rich is going to say something, then I'll say something.
no, I was just saying, in a major market, any time off the air is worth a panic.
Yeah, and a new engineer.
I don't work there anymore.
Okay,
Care.
Jeff, we've come up on the top of the hour here, and I know you've got to either get on with what you're doing or get ready to tear the booth down. Would you, before you go away, do two things? Number one, turn your camera around and show those who come in a little bit about where you are. And secondly, tell us a little bit about what you're planning for your next Tuesday soiree.
All right, so this is one aisle of the Texas Association of Broadcasters show. I'm chasing Miles around with the camera, and he's trying to outrun me. But so this is one aisle out of 7 of the expo area. There's a total of roughly 1,500 people here and 100-odd exhibitors. TTT sessions, I've got no idea what our next ones are. I know what I think I want to do, but we've got the meeting to do that coming up next Tuesday. So hopefully you'll see that published shortly. I'm on the road till the end of August, so we probably won't do anything else until September. So.
All right, then you'll be back in September.
I absolutely will. Yeah.
Do you know what you're going to talk about in September?
Oh my God, I don't know what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. So no, we'll figure that out like we always do. Usually the day before, a couple of days before. But I've got some ideas. There's some things that I think I want to address a little more over the next little while. And so I'll reach out to you. And you mentioned something about an email also. So we'll have a conversation offline on that.
Jeff
good.
at the show reminds me of seeing Larry King do his show at NAB. So you're in good company.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm. Yes. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for taking the time out, because you're there to sell things.
Well,
And,
you know, it all ties together. But I tell people I'm mostly here to have fun, and things sell themselves kind of as an incidental side note to that.
So, well, enjoy whatever you can there in Austin. Get some good barbecue before you go. And
Oh, you know it.
we'll talk to you soonly, as they say.
All right. Very good. Thanks very much, folks. We'll see you next time.
Take care, Jeff.